Sarah stepped out of her car and took a deep breath. The sprawling family estate stood before her, a vision of old-world charm wrapped in modern-day splendor. It was exactly as she remembered from childhood summers spent running through the endless gardens and playing hide-and-seek in the towering halls. But today, the sight of it filled her with a strange mix of nostalgia and dread. As she walked up the cobblestone path toward the front entrance, she could already hear the familiar hum of laughter and conversation spilling out from the open windows. The annual family reunion had always been an elaborate affair, and this year was no different. Her mother, the ever-gracious host, had once again outdone herself, organizing a weekend event that was part party, part showcase of their family's legacy. Inside, the house buzzed with life. Sarah greeted cousins, aunts, and uncles, exchanging pleasantries as she moved through the grand foyer. The atmosphere was light and cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Sarah couldn't quite shake. She scanned the room for her sister, Rachel, who had always been the social butterfly at these gatherings. No sign of her yet. Sarah's mind wandered as she moved from one conversation to the next. She thought about how much had changed since the last reunion. Life had pulled them all in different directions, but still, there was something about this reunion that felt different. The laughter was just a little too loud, the smiles a bit too forced. As she entered the dining room, she spotted Jake, her cousin, standing by the far wall. He was alone, a glass of wine in hand, watching the room with an intensity that made Sarah pause. Jake had always been a bit of a mystery, never quite fitting into the tightly knit family mold. And while everyone else seemed caught up in the celebration, he stood apart, as if observing the scene from the outside. Sarah made her way over to him, forcing a smile. "Jake, how are you?" He looked at her for a moment, his face unreadable. "Same as always, I guess." His response was curt, and Sarah sensed something simmering beneath the surface. Before she could ask more, their aunt's voice echoed through the room, calling everyone to dinner. Jake gave her a fleeting smile, and they both moved toward the long dining table. The evening unfolded smoothly, with conversations flowing freely between bites of a lavish meal. Yet, as Sarah glanced around the table, her gaze caught Rachel's just as she entered the room, walking in late with Oliver, another cousin. There was something in Rachel's expression that set Sarah on edge. It was subtle, but to Sarah, who had always been closest to her sister, it was impossible to miss. She couldn't place it, but something wasn't right. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself slipping into her usual role, the peacekeeper. It had been this way for as long as she could remember. Every family had their dynamics, and in this one, Sarah had always been the glue that held everything together. She moved between the different groups, smoothing over awkward moments, stepping in to redirect conversations when they veered into uncomfortable territory. Her mother had raised her well for these events. Sarah knew how to handle small conflicts before they turned into full-blown arguments. She'd been doing it for years. Rachel's absence from the earlier part of the evening had not gone unnoticed, though. While everyone else seemed to move past it quickly, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something was off, and it wasn't just about Rachel arriving late. The way Rachel and Oliver sat together at the far end of the table, sharing quiet words, seemed out of place. As the evening stretched on, Sarah found herself watching them closely, wondering if there was more to their connection than met the eye. She tried to dismiss the thought. After all, they were family, cousins even. But every time she caught them exchanging glances, a little voice in her head grew louder. Was it possible something was happening that she didn't know about? By the time dessert was served, Sarah's nerves were frayed. She'd managed to keep the evening running smoothly, but there was a tension building beneath the surface that she couldn't ignore. Jake, too, seemed unusually quiet, his eyes darting between Rachel and Oliver with a strange intensity. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for a moment to strike. But what moment? What was he holding back? "Sarah, dear, could you help me with the dishes?" her mother asked, pulling her away from her thoughts. Sarah nodded, grateful for the distraction. As she gathered plates from the table, she overheard snippets of conversation behind her, small whispers about Rachel and Oliver. Were they being subtle, or was it just her heightened senses picking up on things that weren't really there? Whatever it was, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Something was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. As she loaded the plates into the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of Rachel heading upstairs with Oliver, a fleeting glance over her shoulder. It was quick, but it was enough to set Sarah's pulse racing. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe it was nothing. But maybe, just maybe, her instincts were right. Sarah returned to the dining room, but her thoughts were no longer on the family reunion. They were on Rachel, Oliver, and the strange feeling that her carefully constructed family world was about to crack wide open. As the sun began to set on the estate, the golden light filtering through the large windows softened the edges of the grand gathering. Most of the family had moved to the lounge area, chatting casually over coffee and dessert, but Jake remained seated in the dining room. His fingers tapped absently on the rim of his empty glass, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the next room. From his spot, Jake could see Rachel and Oliver speaking quietly near the fireplace. His lip curled in disdain. No one else seemed to notice their closeness, but Jake had seen it coming for months. And now, as he watched them exchange what they thought were discreet glances, the simmering anger that had been building inside him for years threatened to spill over. It wasn't just Rachel and Oliver. No, it was the whole family. They had always looked down on him, hadn't they? He was the odd one out, the black sheep. Even now, as everyone mingled and laughed, Jake sat on the outskirts, unnoticed, unimportant. His own parents had passed when he was young, and since then, he had always been treated like the outsider, the pity case. He was invited out of obligation, never out of love. But that would change tonight. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the deep red liquid spin in circles. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing what was about to unfold. For too long, Jake had stayed quiet, holding his tongue while the rest of the family went about their perfect lives. He knew things, secrets they thought they could keep hidden. But tonight, he would be the one to shatter their facade. Rachel. Perfect, beloved Rachel. Always the center of attention, always the golden child. Jake had seen through her act for years, but no one else had. Until now. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment to expose her for what she really was. A liar, a cheat. He took another sip of wine, his eyes narrowing as Oliver placed a hand on Rachel's arm. The sight made Jake's blood boil. It wasn't fair. Oliver had always been the golden boy, the charming one who could do no wrong. But Jake knew better. He had seen them together, and he knew exactly what was going on between them. They thought they were so clever, hiding it from the rest of the family, but they hadn't hidden it from him. Jake's grip tightened on his glass. Tonight was his chance to take control, to finally make them see him, to make them pay attention. He would show them all the truth, and when he did, they would have no choice but to look at him, really look at him, for the first time in years. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a screech that caught the attention of a few nearby cousins. He ignored their questioning looks and walked out of the dining room, heading straight for the lounge. His pulse quickened as he approached Rachel and Oliver, his plan forming in his mind. Soon, he thought, very soon. The warmth of the fire in the lounge should have been comforting, but Sarah could sense the shift in the atmosphere. She watched as Jake entered the room, his expression unreadable. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd before they settled on Rachel and Oliver. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Everyone. Jake's voice broke through the chatter, stopping conversations in their tracks. He raised his glass, a strained smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. I think it's time for a toast. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong. The air was heavy with anticipation, and Jake's voice had an edge to it that made her uneasy. She glanced at Rachel, who had gone pale, her eyes wide as she looked at Jake. Before we wrap up this lovely evening, Jake continued, his voice dripping with mock cheer, I just wanted to say a few words about family. After all, what's more important than family, right? A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but most of the guests exchanged confused looks, sensing the tension. Sarah took a step forward, instinctively moving closer to her sister. "Jake, what are you doing?" she whispered under her breath. But he ignored her, his focus entirely on the crowd before him. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately," Jake said, his tone growing darker. "About trust, loyalty, and honesty." His eyes flicked to Rachel and Oliver, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw a smirk cross his face. Her heart pounded in her chest. No, she thought, please, not now, not like this. And in the spirit of honesty, Jake continued, raising his glass higher, "I think it's time to share a little secret that some of you may not know. You see, family is supposed to be built on trust, but what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when the people you care about betray you?" The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on Jake now, waiting for him to drop the bombshell they all knew was coming. Sarah could feel the tension radiating off her sister. She glanced at Rachel, whose hands were shaking, her face ashen. "Rachel," Jake said, his voice low but clear, "do you want to tell them, or should I?" Rachel's breath hitched, and Oliver stood frozen beside her, his face a mask of shock and fear. The room seemed to shrink around them as all eyes turned to the pair, waiting for the revelation that would tear everything apart. Jake's smile widened as he took a slow sip of his wine, savoring the moment. "No, I guess I'll do it, then." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Rachel and Oliver," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "have been having an affair. For months." The reaction was immediate. Gasps filled the room, and the once warm atmosphere turned icy cold. Sarah felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. She looked at her sister in disbelief, her mind struggling to process the words. An affair. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the revelation crashing down on her. She had known something was wrong, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. As chaos erupted around her, Sarah stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on Rachel and Oliver. The room blurred as voices rose in shock and anger, accusations flying through the air. But all Sarah could see was her sister, the sister she had trusted, the sister she had protected, now standing at the center of a storm she had created. The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and confusion. Mark, who had been sitting at the far end of the room, stood frozen, his face as pale as a sheet. His eyes darted between Rachel and Oliver, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Sarah, still processing Jake's bombshell, felt her pulse racing. She had never seen a family gathering fall apart this quickly. All around her, relatives were whispering, gasping, and pointing, their shocked expressions reflecting the enormity of what had just been revealed. Jake, meanwhile, had taken a step back, his smug smile a stark contrast to the chaos he had unleashed. He had done what he came to do. As far as he was concerned, his job was finished. "Rachel." Mark's voice finally broke through the noise, loud and trembling with emotion. "Is this true?" Rachel's eyes were wide with panic, her lips trembling as she searched for words. She looked at Oliver, whose face was now buried in his hands, and then back at her husband. Her silence, in that moment, spoke volumes. Mark's face twisted in anguish, his disbelief turning into rage. "How could you do this?" His voice cracked, and it was clear to everyone that he was barely holding it together. "After everything, after all we've been through." Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked desperately at Sarah, as if pleading for her to step in, to save her from the storm. But this time, Sarah didn't know what to say. She had always been the mediator, the one who kept everyone calm. But now she felt as lost as everyone else. "I can explain," Rachel finally whispered, but her voice was too weak, too shaky. The room was too far gone for explanations. Mark took a deep breath, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice cold and final. "I trusted you. I loved you." His eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain as he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Rachel standing there, tears beginning to fall down her face. Sarah moved toward her sister, her instincts kicking in despite the shock that still gripped her. "Rachel," she whispered, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. But before she could reach her, Oliver stood up, his face pale, and grabbed Rachel's arm. "We should go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The room was still buzzing with whispers, the shock of the revelation rippling through the family like wildfire. Sarah watched as her sister, barely holding herself together, allowed Oliver to lead her out of the room. They disappeared up the stairs, leaving the rest of the family to deal with the wreckage. As the noise in the room began to die down, Sarah found herself standing alone in the middle of it all, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Her heart ached for Mark, for Rachel, for the family that had been shattered in one evening. She glanced around and saw that Jake was nowhere to be found. He had slipped out, leaving behind the chaos he had so gleefully created. Sarah's mind raced. She had always known Jake held grudges, but this was beyond anything she had expected. He had torn the family apart with just a few words, and now Sarah was left to pick up the pieces. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Sarah woke early, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. She hadn't slept much. The image of Rachel's tear-streaked face, the look of utter betrayal on Mark's, and the smug satisfaction on Jake's haunted her. She made her way downstairs, hoping for a moment of peace before the rest of the family awoke. As she entered the kitchen, she found Mark sitting at the table, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. His disheveled appearance showed he hadn't slept either. "Mark," Sarah said softly, unsure of how to even begin. He looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I thought I knew her. I thought we were happy." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat beside him. She had no words of comfort to offer, no magic fix for the pain he was feeling. All she could do was listen. "I didn't see it coming," Mark continued, his voice breaking. "How could she do this? With Oliver of all people, my own cousin." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It's like I don't even know my own family anymore." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I wish I could make sense of it, but I'm as shocked as you are." For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. Sarah wanted to say something, anything, to make him feel better, but what could she possibly say? Rachel had made her choices, and now the family was left to deal with the fallout. After a while, Mark stood up, his face set in grim determination. "I need to talk to her," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. "I need to know why." Sarah watched him leave the kitchen, a sinking feeling in her stomach. She wanted to follow him, to be there for Rachel too, but she knew that this was something Mark and Rachel needed to work out on their own, if it could be worked out at all. The morning dragged on in a haze of quiet tension. Family members avoided each other, speaking only in hushed tones when they crossed paths. The festive atmosphere of the previous day had been replaced by a thick cloud of unease, and Sarah could feel the tension building with each passing hour. By noon, she hadn't seen either Rachel or Jake, and that only made her more uneasy. Jake had caused all of this, but where was he now? What was his endgame? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished yet, that there was more he wanted to destroy. Later that afternoon, Sarah found Rachel in the garden, sitting alone on a bench beneath a large oak tree. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she looked more fragile than Sarah had ever seen her. "Rachel," Sarah said softly as she approached. Rachel didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" Sarah sat beside her, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know, Rachel. I don't understand why you did it, but we can figure this out together." Rachel shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't even know why I did it. I felt trapped, and Oliver was, I don't know. I made a terrible mistake, and now I've lost everything." Sarah's heart broke for her sister, but at the same time, she couldn't help feeling angry. How could Rachel have been so reckless, so selfish? Mark's devastated Rachel. He doesn't know what to do. I know, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I don't know how to fix it. Sarah looked at her sister, struggling with her own feelings of betrayal. She had always been the one to protect Rachel, to help her through tough times. But this was something Sarah wasn't sure she could fix. Mark found Rachel sitting on the edge of the bed in their room, her face streaked with dried tears. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and puffy, but there was no trace of the Rachel he once knew. The weight of the night's events hung between them like a dense fog, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. Mark, Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment between them. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at her. His heart was a storm of anger, confusion, and betrayal. The words Jake had spoken echoed in his head on a loop. An affair with Oliver, his cousin. The very thought made his stomach churn. How long? He finally asked, his voice hoarse. He needed answers. He needed to understand. Rachel flinched at the question, her gaze dropping to the floor. A few months. Mark let out a sharp breath, his fists clenching at his sides. Months. And you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think you owed me that? Rachel began, her voice shaking. I didn't know how to tell you. I was confused. Mark's voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. You were having an affair with my cousin, Rachel. What's confusing about that? Tears welled in her eyes again, but Mark couldn't find it in himself to comfort her. Not now. Not after everything. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room in frustration. I trusted you, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I trusted you with everything. How could you betray me like this? Rachel sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking, but Mark's fury only grew. He had poured everything into their relationship, into their marriage, and now it all felt like a lie. How could he ever trust her again? I don't know what to say, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry, Mark. I made a mistake. Mark stopped pacing and stared at her, his chest heaving with emotion. A mistake? You call this a mistake? This isn't just some small slip-up, Rachel. You broke our marriage. You broke us. Rachel wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. I know I did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I don't know if I can. Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. Rachel's sobs grew louder, and for the first time, Mark felt a flicker of something other than anger. He wasn't sure if it was pity or exhaustion, but seeing her like this, so broken, made him pause. I don't know what to do, Mark admitted quietly. I thought we were happy. We were, Rachel whispered through her tears. But I was lost. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I didn't know how to fix what I was feeling. Mark shook his head, his mind racing. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the one who had betrayed him so deeply. Part of him wanted to walk out of the room and never look back, but another part, a small, broken part, wanted to understand, wanted to try. I need time, Mark finally said, his voice weary. I don't know what this means for us, but I can't make any decisions right now. Rachel nodded, though her tears didn't stop. I understand. Mark turned and left the room, his heart heavy with the weight of a future he no longer recognized. As he walked down the hallway, he passed family members who quickly averted their gazes, pretending not to see his pain. It was a lie they all participated in, this facade of normalcy, even as everything crumbled around them. The aftermath of Jake's revelation continued to ripple through the family like an unstoppable wave, leaving destruction in its wake. Sarah watched from the sidelines as conversations that once flowed freely now felt strained, awkward. Family members who had spent the previous day laughing and reminiscing were now whispering in hushed tones, casting side glances at Rachel and Mark, who kept to themselves. Sarah felt the burden of the mediator weighing on her shoulders again. Her instinct was to step in, to smooth things over as she always had, but this time, it felt different. The cracks in the family were too deep, the damage too severe. No amount of placating words could fix this. Jake was nowhere to be found for most of the day, a ghost in the aftermath of the chaos he had caused. Sarah had searched for him, not to confront him, but to understand why he had done this. What had driven him to tear their family apart? But each time she asked, she was met with the same response: he wasn't ready to talk. As the day wore on, factions began to form within the family. Some cousins whispered that Rachel had made a terrible mistake, but she deserved another chance. Others weren't so forgiving. They condemned her, saying she had humiliated Mark and betrayed the family's trust. Sarah overheard snippets of these conversations, each one making her heart ache a little more. Rachel, once the shining star of the family, was now the subject of whispered gossip and judgmental stares. Mark, on the other hand, was treated with kid gloves, as if one wrong word would shatter him completely. The most surprising divide, however, was the one involving Oliver. He had disappeared shortly after the toast, retreating to his room in shame. Oliver's parents, who had once adored Rachel as if she were their own daughter, now looked at her with disdain, and it was clear that the divide between the two sides of the family was widening by the hour. At lunch, Sarah sat beside her mother, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the day. The family matriarch had always been the one to maintain control, to keep the family in line, but now, even she seemed at a loss for what to do. This family, her mother began, her voice shaky. "We're falling apart, Sarah. I don't know how to fix this." Sarah sighed, her own heart heavy with the same realization. "Maybe we can't fix it," she admitted. Not this time. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, something Sarah had rarely seen. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought Rachel would." "She didn't mean for it to happen like this," Sarah interrupted, though the words felt hollow. "But now we have to deal with the consequences." The rest of lunch passed in strained silence, and by the time the plates were cleared, the divide between family members had grown even more pronounced. Sarah felt it like a weight in the air, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Later that evening, she found herself in the garden once again, needing a moment to breathe, to think. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the estate, but the beauty of the scene was lost on her. All she could think about was the wreckage Jake had left in his wake. As she wandered the paths, she spotted Jake standing by the fountain, his hands deep in his pockets. He looked up when he saw her approaching, but there was no sign of regret in his expression. "You did this," Sarah said quietly as she reached him. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact. Jake shrugged. "They did it to themselves. I just sped up the inevitable." Sarah stared at him, disbelief coursing through her. "Do you even care? Do you realize what you've done to this family?" "They'll get over it," Jake said, his tone casual. "They always do." Sarah shook her head, anger bubbling up inside her. "Not this time, Jake. You've gone too far." Jake met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "Maybe it's about time someone did." The next morning, Sarah found her mother sitting alone in the library, staring blankly at the large windows overlooking the garden. It was a rare sight to see the family matriarch looking so lost. Normally, her mother was the pillar of strength for everyone, always composed, always in control. But now, as the sun filtered through the curtains, she looked small, defeated even. "Mom," Sarah said softly as she entered the room. Her mother didn't respond at first, her eyes still fixed on the world outside. Then, slowly, she turned to look at Sarah, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you so early." "I wanted to check on you," Sarah replied, sitting beside her. "After everything that's happened." Her mother sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Yes, after everything." Her voice trailed off, and Sarah noticed a tremor in her hands as she fiddled with the edge of her shawl. "Mom, what's going on?" Sarah asked gently. "You've been so quiet since Jake's toast. I know this must be hard for you. But is there something you're not telling me?" Her mother didn't meet her eyes, and for a long moment, there was only silence between them. Finally, her mother sighed deeply and turned to face Sarah. "I knew." Sarah blinked, confusion settling over her. Knew what? I knew about Rachel and Oliver, her mother admitted, her voice filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. I've known for months. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. You knew. Her mother nodded slowly. I found out by accident. I overheard them talking at a family gathering a few months ago. At first, I thought I had misheard, but it became clear that they were involved in something more than just family. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stop it? I thought I could fix it, her mother replied, her voice cracking with emotion. I thought if I gave them time, they would come to their senses and end it. I didn't want to make it public. I didn't want to shame them, to destroy our family. Sarah shook her head, disbelief flooding her. So you just let go on? I tried to speak to Rachel, her mother said, her hands wringing the fabric of her shawl. I tried to reason with her, to make her see that what she was doing was wrong. But she wouldn't listen. She was so stubborn. Sarah felt a mix of anger and betrayal swelling inside her. Her mother had known. Her mother, the one person she thought she could rely on, had kept this secret. And for what? To protect Rachel? To protect the family's reputation? You should have told me, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I could have helped. I didn't want to burden you, her mother said softly. You already carry so much on your shoulders. I thought I could handle it. But now, she paused, her eyes filling with tears. Now everything's fallen apart. Sarah stood, pacing the room in frustration. Mom, this isn't just about Rachel anymore. This is about the entire family. Jake exposed everything in the worst possible way, and now we're all dealing with the fallout. I know, her mother said quietly. I never wanted it to come to this. Sarah stopped pacing, her mind swirling with questions. Why had her mother stayed silent for so long? Why hadn't she done more to stop the affair before it spiraled out of control? But most of all, Sarah wondered how much more the family could take before it shattered completely. The weight of the revelation sat heavy on Sarah's shoulders as she left the library. She couldn't believe her mother had known all along, had chosen to stay silent while the affair unraveled behind the scenes. How could someone so strong, so capable, allow such a secret to fester in the family? And now, here they were, dealing with the aftermath. As she walked through the hallways of the estate, Sarah felt the familiar pressure of being the mediator. But this time it was different. The truth had fractured her trust in her own family. She wasn't sure how to navigate the chaos anymore. There was no simple fix, no words she could offer to smooth things over. The divide between Rachel, Oliver, and the rest of the family seemed too vast to bridge. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when she spotted Rachel in the garden once again. Her sister had been avoiding most of the family since the reveal, keeping to herself and barely speaking. Sarah hadn't decided if she was ready to confront Rachel about what she had just learned from their mother. Not yet. Not until she understood her own feelings. Rachel didn't notice Sarah approaching until she was only a few feet away. She looked up, her eyes bloodshot, her expression weary. Hey, she muttered, her voice hoarse from crying. Hey, Sarah replied softly. She sat down beside her sister on the stone bench, the silence between them heavy and awkward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of birds chirping in the distance and the gentle rustling of the trees were the only noises that filled the space between them. Sarah stared at the ground, trying to find the right words, but everything felt wrong. I talked to Mom, Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. Rachel's face tightened, her gaze dropping to the ground. I figured you would. She knew. Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with tension. She knew about you and Oliver. For months. Rachel winced at the mention of her mother, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. Yeah, she knew. Why didn't you stop? Sarah asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why didn't you end it before everything blew up like this? Rachel shook her head, her voice small and broken. It wasn't that simple, Sarah. Wasn't that simple. Sarah's voice rose. You were having an affair, Rachel. You were lying to your husband, to the whole family. And now look where we are. Everything's falling apart. Rachel wiped at her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want it to be like this," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt Mark or anyone, but I felt so trapped. I didn't know how to get out." Sarah's heart ached at the vulnerability in her sister's voice, but she couldn't shake the anger that simmered beneath the surface. "And Oliver?" she asked quietly. "What about him? How did this even start?" Rachel hesitated, the shame clear on her face. "It started small," she admitted. We talk a lot. About things Mark and I never talked about." "I don't know, Sarah. It just happened." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to control her emotions. It was all so much. A swirling storm of betrayal, guilt, and broken trust. She had always been the one to help Rachel through her problems, to stand by her side. But this was different. This wasn't something Sarah could fix. "Mark deserves better," Sarah said, her voice hard. "He didn't deserve this." "I know," Rachel whispered, her tears falling again. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Sarah stood up, unable to sit any longer. The weight of it all was too much. "I need time, Rachel. I don't know what to do with all of this. I need time." Rachel nodded, her face crumpling as she wept quietly. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." Sarah walked away, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She wasn't sure if she could forgive her sister for what she had done. And as much as she wanted to be the peacemaker, to hold the family together, Sarah knew this time it might be impossible. By the time evening rolled around, the tension in the house had become unbearable. Sarah couldn't take the silence, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the awkward glances exchanged between family members. Something had to be done. She called everyone together into the large living room, where the family used to gather for holiday celebrations and important announcements. But now, instead of laughter and joy, the room was thick with apprehension. The family members filtered in slowly, some reluctant, others curious, and a few outright hostile. Mark sat at the far end, his eyes hollow, while Rachel remained on the opposite side, her gaze fixed on the floor. Oliver, too, sat quietly, his presence only amplifying the tension. Even Jake showed up, a faint smirk on his face, as if he were enjoying the wreckage he had caused. Sarah's stomach churned with frustration at the sight of him, but she knew she had to keep control of the situation. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, her voice firm though her heart raced. "I know things have been difficult, and I don't think any of us expected this reunion to turn into what it has, but thought it was time for us to talk, really talk, before this family falls apart any further." There were murmurs of agreement from some, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Her mother sat silently beside her, looking older and more fragile than Sarah had ever seen her. "What do you want us to say, Sarah?" one of her cousins asked. "This is a mess, a complete mess." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know it is, but avoiding it isn't going to help us fix anything. We need to face what's happened. We need to talk about the damage that's been done, or this family won't survive it." Mark leaned forward, his voice cold. "What's there to talk about? Rachel had an affair. She betrayed me. And now our marriage is over. End of story." Rachel flinched at his words, but she didn't argue. She seemed too worn down to defend herself anymore. "It's not just about Rachel and Mark," Sarah said carefully. "This has affected all of us. There are other relationships here, relationships that are being torn apart. And if we don't deal with it, if we don't try to heal, we'll lose more than just one marriage." Her gaze shifted to Oliver, who avoided eye contact with everyone. His parents, sitting across from him, were stone-faced, their disappointment clear. "I'm sorry," Oliver said quietly. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." One of the older relatives, Aunt Linda, shook her head. "That's the thing, isn't it? No one ever means for it to happen. But it does. And we all have to live with the consequences." Sarah could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. She had hoped this meeting would lead to some kind of resolution, but now it seemed to be spiraling into a pit of bitterness and regret. She needed to steer it back before it got worse. "Look," Sarah said, raising her voice slightly. "We can't change what happened, but we can decide how we're going to move forward. This family has been through a lot over the years, but we've always managed to stick together. That's what we need to focus on. How we can repair the damage and rebuild our relationships. Rebuild. Jake scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. After what Rachel and Oliver did, after what our mother knew and didn't say, you really think there's anything left to rebuild? Sarah's patience snapped. What are you trying to accomplish, Jake? She asked, her voice sharp. What do you get out of all of this? Is this what you wanted? To see us all fighting? To watch this family fall apart? Jake leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading slightly. I didn't cause this, Sarah. I just told the truth. You didn't have to, Sarah shot back. You could have handled it differently, but you chose to expose it in the worst possible way. Why? Jake hesitated, his expression hardening. Because I'm tired of pretending everything's perfect in this family when it's not. I'm tired of being the one on the outside while everyone else gets to live in their little fantasy world. Maybe now you all see that things aren't as perfect as you thought. Sarah stared at him, her heart sinking. Jake's bitterness had run deeper than she had realized, and now they were all paying the price for it. After the disastrous family meeting, Sarah found herself emotionally drained, the weight of the family's fractures pressing down on her. She retreated to her room for a few moments of quiet, but soon enough, there was a knock on her door. It was Rachel, her eyes swollen from tears, her expression one of guilt and exhaustion. Can I come in? Rachel asked softly. Sarah hesitated but nodded. Rachel stepped inside, her movements slow and hesitant, as though she feared Sarah might lash out at any moment. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to right now, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't leave without saying something. Sarah remained silent, unsure of what Rachel could possibly say to make things better. Her mind was still reeling from a conversation with their mother, from Jake's twisted sense of justice, from the whole family crumbling before her eyes. Rachel took a deep breath, sitting on the edge of Sarah's bed. I messed up, Sarah. I know that. And I'm so sorry for everything I've done. For hurting Mark, for hurting you, for dragging this family through the mud. Sarah stared at her, her heart torn between anger and compassion. I don't understand why, Rachel. I don't understand how you could do this. You had everything, a good husband, a family that loved you. Why would you risk it all? Rachel shook her head, her voice breaking as she spoke. I don't know. I wish I could explain it, but I can't. I just felt trapped. I felt like everything in my life was closing in on me, and Oliver was there. He listened to me in a way Mark didn't. I know it was wrong. I know I betrayed everyone, but at the time, I didn't think about the consequences. Sarah felt her anger rising again. You didn't think about the consequences? Do you realize what you've done, Rachel? You've destroyed Mark. You've torn this family apart. I know, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. And I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. Sarah clenched her fists, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to scream at her sister, to tell her how much she had hurt everyone, but at the same time, she saw the brokenness in Rachel's eyes. Her sister wasn't the villain she had painted her to be. She was just a person who had made a terrible mistake, and now she was paying the price for it. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah said finally, her voice shaking. I don't know if this is something any of us can come back from. Rachel nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the distance between them growing. Sarah wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but she couldn't. Not yet. The pain was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. I'm leaving tomorrow, Rachel said quietly, standing up from the bed. I don't think it's fair for me to stay here any longer. Sarah nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. As Rachel turned to leave, Sarah's heart ached with the loss of the sister she had once known. They had always been close, always relied on each other, but now that bond felt irreparably broken. I'll be here if you need me, Rachel said softly before stepping out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. She wasn't sure what the future held for their relationship or for the family as a whole, but one thing was clear. nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the family meeting, the house was wrapped in a heavy, oppressive silence. Sarah hadn't slept much, her mind racing with thoughts of Rachel, Jake, and the tangled mess that had overtaken the family. The bright morning sun streaming through the windows only seemed to highlight the stark contrast between the beauty of the estate and the emotional devastation within its walls. Sarah walked down the hallway, heading toward the dining room, when she saw Mark standing by the front door, his suitcase in hand. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. "Mark," she called, her voice laced with concern. "Where are you going?" He turned slowly, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. "I'm leaving, Sarah," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I can't stay here any longer." Sarah walked toward him, her mind reeling. "But what about Rachel? What about the family? We still need to figure this out." Mark shook his head, his eyes heavy with pain. "There's nothing left to figure out. My marriage is over. I can't stay here and pretend that everything's fine when it's not. Rachel made her choice, and now I have to make mine." Sarah's chest tightened as she looked at her brother-in-law, the man who had been part of their family for so many years. She had always admired his quiet strength, his loyalty to Rachel, but now that strength seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I wish there was something I could do." Mark gave her a small, sad smile. "You've always been the one to hold this family together, Sarah, but this isn't something you can fix. Rachel and we're done. There's no going back from this." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, unsure of how to respond. She had hoped that somehow, despite everything, there might still be a chance for reconciliation. But looking at Mark now, she realized that hope had been in vain. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. "I don't know yet," Mark admitted. "I just need to get away from here, away from all of this. Maybe once I'm gone, I'll be able to think more clearly." Sarah nodded, though the words felt hollow. She wanted to stop him, to convince him to stay, but she knew it wasn't her place. Mark had been through enough, and if leaving was what he needed to heal, then she had to respect that. "Take care of yourself, Mark," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "And if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Mark nodded, his eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you, Sarah. You've always been a good friend." With that, he turned and opened the front door, the cold morning air rushing in as he stepped outside. Sarah watched him go, her heart aching as the sound of a suitcase rolling across the driveway echoed through the stillness of the house. As the door closed behind him, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of loss wash over her. Mark was gone, and with him, any hope of salvaging the life Rachel had destroyed. The family had fractured, and Sarah didn't know if it could ever be whole again. By the time the last day of the reunion arrived, the mood in the house had shifted from tension to quiet resignation. Most of the family members had withdrawn into themselves, avoiding conversations about the events of the past few days. The once lively gathering had become a somber, almost ghostly affair, and Sarah felt the weight of it pressing down on her with every step she took. Rachel, too, had kept to herself, emerging only for meals and spending most of her time alone in the garden or her room. Oliver had left without a word, and Jake, who had caused the initial chaos, seemed oddly content to let things settle without further provocation. Sarah, though, couldn't let it end this way. She couldn't let the reunion conclude with the family broken and bitter. She had spent her whole life trying to keep the family together, and even though she knew she couldn't fix everything, she couldn't stand the idea of leaving without at least trying to mend some of the cracks. On the last afternoon, Sarah found herself back in the garden, the place where so many of her conversations with Rachel had taken place. This time, however, it wasn't Rachel she sought out. It was Jake. She found him sitting by the fountain, staring at the water, his usual smirk replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Jake," Sarah said as she approached, her voice steady but calm. He glanced up at her, his face betraying no surprise. "Sarah, here to give me a lecture?" She shook her head, sitting down beside him. "No, I'm here to try to understand." Jake let out a small, humorless laugh. Understand what? Why blew everything up? Sarah sighed, folding her hands in her lap. I don't agree with what you did, but I want to know why. I need to understand why you felt the need to expose everything the way you did. Jake was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the rippling water in the fountain. Because I'm tired, Sarah. I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not. This family has been broken for a long time, and no one wanted to see it. Everyone just goes along with their perfect little lives, ignoring all the cracks. But do you really have to do it like that? Sarah asked, her voice soft but firm. You hurt a lot of people, Jake. You could have handled it differently. Jake shook his head. Maybe. But nothing would have changed. You know that. This family, we've been walking on eggshells for years. All I did was stop pretending. Sarah looked at him, her heart heavy with a mix of sadness and understanding. Jake had always been on the outside, always carrying the weight of feeling like the family outcast. And while she didn't agree with his methods, she could see the pain behind his actions. I know it's not perfect, Sarah said quietly. And I know there's a lot we need to fix. But blowing everything up like this, it's only made things harder. Jake met her gaze, his expression softening for the first time in days. Maybe. But now at least everyone sees the truth. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge. Sarah nodded, though the knot in her chest remained. I just wish it hadn't cost us so much. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fountain the only noise between them. Sarah didn't know if the family could ever fully recover from what had happened, but in that moment, she realized that maybe Jake's actions, however destructive, had forced them all to confront the reality they had been avoiding for so long. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the estate, Sarah stood up, her heart heavy but resolute. She couldn't fix everything, but she could at least start the process of healing. I'm leaving tomorrow, Sarah said quietly. I don't know what's going to happen with the family, but I hope we can find a way to move forward. Jake nodded, his gaze distant. Yeah, I hope so too. As she walked back toward the house, Sarah felt a strange sense of closure settle over her. The family reunion had turned into something far darker than she had anticipated, but maybe, just maybe, it had also given them the opportunity to rebuild, one step at a time. And as she entered the house, she knew that whatever the future held, she would do everything she could to help her family heal. Hey, everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what moment impacted you the most in this story. Your feedback is so important. And if you have any ideas for future stories you'd like to see on the channel, drop your suggestions below. We're always excited to hear your creative thoughts. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more incredible stories.